iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hello and welcome back to the iHeartPodcast Speakers Series. I'm Will Pearson, president of iHeartPodcast. Always good to be with you. As you know, each week we like to have a conversation with one of our favorite creators, a podcaster, a producer, an executive in the industry, talk about their podcast and the state of podcasting. And I think we've talked about this a few times before, but over the past few years, we've seen an interesting shift in what podcast listeners have been looking for. You know, in a difficult time, whether it's through the pandemic or other challenges, we saw listeners rather, looking in a couple of different directions. We saw listeners, on the one hand, looking to comedy and pop culture and entertainment as sort of an escape from the things that may be stressful in the world around them. And then on the other hand, we saw listeners looking for mental health help as they think about, addressing that head on. And so we've seen huge growth in both the general health and wellness space and the mental health space. And there was an interesting conversation we had not too long ago with the host of the Happiness Lab, Dr. Laurie Santos. And we'd asked her, what is the thing that you feel is most underrated in people's mental health, not just their physical health? And she said sleep. She said, we don't think about it enough when we want to address mental health issues and also just general health issues. Well, today's conversation is going to help us address that. There's this fantastic podcast, if you have not already been familiar with it, called Nothing Much Happens. And the entire goal of this podcast is to help us sleep better. And to discuss this, we have the creator, the host of this podcast. It's one of the top 1% of all podcasts in the world. It's had over 100 million downloads. But Kathryn Nicolai, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, this has become a hit, and I guess we shouldn't be that surprised because it's no secret that so many of us struggle with our sleep, day in and day out, and are looking for ways to get better at this and to address our overall health. But maybe let's back up a little bit. If you could tell us a little bit about your background. I know you spent years as a teacher of yoga and meditation and many things in this space of mindfulness and health, but tell us how you got to the idea of creating this podcast.
Yeah, there's kind of two parts of it. One is my own experience, which is that I have my whole life had this technique for falling asleep that really, I think I just figured out as a 4-year-old kid that I could close my eyes and tell myself a story, go someplace really nice, and it would guide me really gently to sleep. And I've used it my whole life. And I always kind of wondered, how do I explain this to somebody else? How do I help them get there if they've never really thought about doing this before? And then I spent about 20 years professionally as a full-time yoga teacher and meditation teacher. And so I'm every day talking to people about their health, their well-being, their mental health, and hearing sort of the common complaints and the problems that people were having, so much with anxiety and insomnia. And one night, I was ironically up in the middle of the night because I had a sick dog, and I thought, oh, it's a podcast. It's a podcast because then I can, use my voice. I can use sort of the skills I'd built as a yoga teacher. How do I use my voice to create a presence, to create sort of an environment where people feel really safe and comfortable? And then can I start to flex these muscles as a writer and a storyteller, which was something that I had been interested in for a long time. And I remember sitting on the floor in the middle of the night ordering a microphone off Amazon. Just it clicked for me so fast that it was the right choice that I did not hesitate. I think we launched about 6 weeks later.
Wow. And can you explain the concept when somebody encounters it for the first time and listens to an episode? Tell us about that, what the goal of the episode is. And then I'd love to talk a little bit about how the episodes connect as well, but I'll let you address that.
So there is, some very easy to understand brain science behind this, which is basically that we're shifting brain activity when we listen to a story. And maybe you've had this experience where you're in bed reading a book, and maybe you're even in a really uncomfortable position and you cannot keep your eyes open. You are fighting to get to the next sentence, and you can't do it. And then you put your book down, you turn off the light, you get as comfortable as you could possibly be, and you can't sleep.
Yep.
And what's happened
Many
there
times.
is Yeah, your brain state has actually shifted, your brain activity. So in that moment when your eyes are moving across the page, or when you're listening to me tell a story, you're in something called the task positive mode, which means your brain has a simple job to do. And when it's doing that job, it's not doing other things. And then when you put the job away, you fall into what we call default mode network. And default mode network is sort of the background static of your brain. It's when your brain feels like it's spinning and just random thoughts are coming up and it's really hard to rein it in. You're in default mode. So what listening to a podcast like mine does is it helps guide you into that task positive network. And people will often find within a few weeks of using it, it is kind of brain training. You get better as the more you do it, that they are falling asleep within 2 or 3 minutes. They never even hear the story. They just hear my introduction. I don't know why I have multiple episodes. Like people listen to the one. So that's the general idea. And, it's the same thing that happens when you read to a child. You're giving their mind a place to rest. Once the mind has a place to rest, the body does what it naturally needs to do. So that's the general idea. And then I approach it because I have this background in mindfulness and self-care. I want it to also just feel good. I think that, when we think about the stuff we know we should do around our sleep hygiene, sometimes we don't end up doing it because it doesn't feel good. It's not that fun. It's like meditation, I always say, is like flossing. You're supposed to be doing it, but it often feels like a chore. And to me, if I can make the things that are naturally good for you feel good, they're going to be so much easier to choose. If you have something to look forward to, you will actually put your phone down and turn off the light and listen in. So I write these stories that are full of sensory details that keeps you in the present moment. And they just sort of highlight everyday nice things, which we just need to feel fortified by.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. The first time somebody told me about the podcast, it was before we started working together. And they described that effect of, being 2 or 3 minutes in and already being fast asleep. I was like, well, that's not going to work for me. That's not that way. And without fail, every time. I'm sure they're lovely stories 20 minutes in, but I never get there. And it's, obviously job well done on that front. Tell us a little bit about how you see these stories connecting to one another.
Yeah, this is, a fun part of writing them for me. I often think of myself a little bit like a modern day Mr. Rogers. I get to build the neighborhood. I get to build the land of make-believe that people come into. And pretty soon writing them, I realized that I was thinking of them all existing in the same universe. I call it the village of nothing much. So, if you are awake to hear them, you'll notice that each story is almost always voiced by a different narrator, but then you might go, wait a minute, I think that lady in the bakery is the same lady from the story I heard last week. And this has already been mentioned. One time I had a story about someone had lost a ring and there was an article in the paper or a notice in the paper and somebody else found it. And that feeling of this interconnectivity to people was just one more thing that pulled them into the world, that made it sort of vibrant and delightful to be a part of. And now I have 5 years in some very well-established characters that people, feel a strong sense of connection and ownership to. And I think that's just lovely.
And I think so too. And how do you come up with the topics for the stories? Is there anything based on, your life, or is it all just coming up with things?
It's almost none of it is about my life. And sometimes people like to think that I am the narrator. And I say, if that gives you comfort, please think that, I have a wonderful, sort of ridiculously charmed life. So that I could totally live in the village of nothing much. But mostly I think part of my training as a yoga teacher was to just be really aware of the present moment and to find things continually to appreciate, to admire, to be grateful for. So I have this running list. Even 200 plus episodes in, I still have like a list of 100 ideas, and I add more every day where I'm like, oh, did you see how beautiful that gate was on the walk and the way that the trumpet vine was growing up? I think that trumpet vine got cut down last year and it grew all the way back. Okay, I have another story. So I feel like I have so many stories still to tell.
I love that. And I know you hear a lot from your listeners because, I'm sure they're incredibly appreciative because they've come to this podcast for a reason, and you're helping them with this. What do you hear from listeners? Are they requesting certain things? Are they sharing certain things? What kinds of things do you hear?
There's such a big spectrum to the experience of interacting with my listeners. And I really love it because, of course, I'm creating something which feels quite personal to me. And it's so deeply intentioned as a form of well-being for other people, but I do it in this little dark room all by myself. And so when somebody else reaches out and tells me their experience, I just really appreciate having that connection. And some people are just simply telling me, I've been an insomniac for 10 years, and now I slept 8 hours, 5 nights in a row, and it changed my life, which I think it absolutely would change your life point. But I also hear from people who say, I'm a survivor, and I used to have night terrors when I would get into bed at night, and I would do all these things to avoid it and be afraid of it. Now I look forward to getting into bed. That's a different life. Or people who tell me, I have had this terrible loss, or I listen while I'm in chemo. I mean, I've had the rare privilege that I take so seriously that sometimes my voice is the last voice a person hears in hospice, because it can be a really grounding, safe feeling, something to play while someone's in the last hours or days of their life where they feel connected to humans and cared for. And I get to be that person. So it runs the spectrum of very lighthearted, hey, can we get another story about Marmalade the cat, to I have had this incredible tragedy and I felt alone at night and your voice was there for me. And I'm so humbled to be able to get to hold people in that way.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly satisfying.
Well, it sounds like you can't stop doing the podcast now then, because you've got so many people relying on you. What's been most surprising for you, or what's been unexpected in terms of the response to the podcast?
I think when I started, I thought that this was a quite niche project. I thought, I don't know how many people are really going to connect to this. Of course, with some perspective, you realize every adult at some point in their adult life, even children, will experience insomnia or anxiety. It is part of being human. So it's actually not niche at all. And so I think I've just been surprised by how many people I've been able to connect with and reach and read a story to.
Yeah. For me, what I've appreciated about is because I've always considered myself not a super skilled sleeper, is I got to the point where I just for years would wait to get in bed until I was just about to collapse, because otherwise it wasn't going to work for me. And so now with a podcast like this, you have the option of knowing my body's tired, my body needs sleep, my brain is tired, but it's still, sort of kind of running crazy. And so now I can do this a little bit earlier and go ahead and address this and allow myself to go to sleep, which is pretty terrific. But I'm curious to hear from you before we let you go. What is next for you? What do you see? Just given the response to this podcast, what else are you thinking about?
Well, I think I'm thinking about a couple of things. A lot of people have told me how much they love my stories, but they never get to hear them because they are actually asleep, but they actually really love the world. And, I've always loved the first part of books before the inciting incident, when it's just somebody living their life before a wrench gets thrown into anything. And, I've been thinking about how can I bring my stories to people in a way that doesn't necessarily produce sleep, because people often say, hey, it would be great to hear these during the day when I'm just feeling anxious, or I had a long day and I'm coming home on my commute and I want to feel calm and good. So I've been working on this show called Stories from the Village of Nothing Much, which we're releasing with iHeart in December. And it's basically compiles 3 stories out of all of my many Nothing Much Happened stories. In each episode, we kind of compile them by theme, and then I read them more upbeat, less soporific. We put in beautiful sound design and music, so it feels like, a grown-up version of getting to go to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and you can listen while you're walking your dog or, doing chores, and it's just a really nice way to, I always say it's like easy listening, but for fiction. So that's next on my horizon, and I'm really excited about it.
I love it. And I know that your listeners will love this as well. But first of all, congratulations on what you've built, but also on behalf of all of us who listen, thank you for doing what you do. This is not a hard mission to get behind, and not a hard podcast for us here at iHeart to get behind, because you really are changing the lives of so many people. And And even for those that just, it helps them sleep a little bit better. That's also really wonderful. But thank you for doing what you do, Kathryn.
Thank you, Will. I feel so lucky to get to do it. I can't believe this is my job. So thank you for helping me get it to more people.
Yeah. So for those, again, that maybe have not listened before, Nothing Much Happens. It's a terrific podcast. Please check it out. And we'll be back again next week. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.